probably not sure that we're going to need the mics.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear us pretty well?
Yep.
Yeah. So we're not even going to use the microphones. Unless we want everybody down there to hear us too. You didn't come to our session? No, I'm just kidding. We appreciate you coming to our session. Give it a little bit longer, maybe what, 5 minutes?
Maybe about 5 minutes or so and we'll get started. Given that things are a little bit more intimate, we're probably going to amend our presentation a little bit more so that it's more conversational, because we also want to hear from you who is interested in learning about your experience, as you are about learning about ours. And also one of the central focuses of today, in addition to sharing about mental illness and what we can do as young leaders to kind of impact that, is to just create a better or foster a sense of connection so that conversations that happen here don't end here and do in fact translate to some meaningful change in our communities. So thank you all for choosing us. We're really excited.
And if you can't hear us at any point, let us know.
Yes.
If there's a smaller group, we didn't need to yell into the microphone.
Me especially, I'm very guilty of talking down. The low voice, it only goes so far.
I do want to ask, is this the CEU?
That is actually just a quick QR code for a check-in.
Okay.
So initially, remember, we thought it might be a little bit bigger. We were going to collect some demographic information. And if you would still like to check in, we would appreciate it. But given that it's a smaller group, I don't know that we can do too much with it.
Okay. Do y'all have the credits that we can get through this?
These ones are not CEU. This and the other 3, they're more informational kind of networking sessions.
Okay.
The Fridays are the CEU days.
Okay. I was here yesterday.
Well, I guess we kind of already got
Yep,
started.
let's do. So, hello everyone. Thank you for choosing our session. I'm Kristie Alsagar. So, a little bit of my youth leadership is I graduated from Texas A&M recently with my NCE for being counselor, and I'm waiting on my state licensing to give me my actual license so I can move forward. But I also am on the board of Sacred.org and on the steering committee for this Pathways to Hope, as well as Bridges to Care. So it's really important to have young leaders in the community to be involved in what we do, and like me and Marlon being a part of our presence lets people know that we're actually interested in what's going on in our community and in our city.
Right. Hello everyone, my name is Marlon Davis. I am also a board member of Sacred, and much like Kristie, I also recently graduated from a sociology grad, and I formally do a lot of research within the realm of housing, specifically as it pertains to how it constitutes within inequality in San Antonio, and what that means for the economic segregation we experience today. I'm also getting ready to go back into the belly of the beast for grad school, so you guys catch me in a very brief window of serene peace, which I'm enjoying. But to the point of leadership, which I also agree with, it's so important that we create and develop our replacements, that we invest in the communities that we serve. Yes.
I think it said to let you know we wanted you to speak a little louder.
Yes.
And just a little more descriptive. I'm sorry. No.
I always feel like I'm yelling if I speak louder, so I'm just going to use the mic. Is this weird?
No, you're good.
Okay.
You can turn it down a little if you want.
I can turn it down. Move away. Can we hear this? Is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just turn it over to the beginning then. Hello everyone, my name is Marlon Davis. I am a student researcher that just recently graduated within sociology, and so I will be soon going back to complete my graduate research and also finish up my postdoc, or not my postdoc, excuse me, my doc. But anyways, yes, I'm a third generation Eastside resident, and so coming back and learning about inequality in a more scientific lens really afforded me an empirical understanding about why things are the way they are, and it afforded me a sense of real literacy and power and being able to translate that to other people that experience these same things. Something that we often talk about within the realm of sociology is that sometimes our material conditions can defeat our imaginations, and when we talk about specifically the realm of mental health, if so many of your basic needs are unmet, it forecloses upon your future because you're struggling to maintain your sense of equilibrium in the present before you can begin to imagine the next version of what your life could be. Yeah.
So I didn't want him to be left out, so now I'm going to use the microphone. To add on to what he's saying, right, it's really important for us to understand where someone is coming from rather than putting on judgment or expecting them to move into a direction that we believe that they fit into. So understanding the culture, the background, the trauma, what they've experienced in their lives is extremely important. What he has left out about himself is he's a huge activist. And that's something that's really important in our young community right now, because we want to go past what the older generation has done. They've nicely laid the pathway to the hope, right? But have not carried it to the end. And we're seeing that in the systemic relationships that we have, and the relationships of what is going on right now with the women's rights and their bodies and what they can do with themselves. And understanding how mental health affects those choices is really important. You know, you can't expect a mother to take on a child that they cannot take care of, and not think that it's going to not have an effect on their mental health. But mental health is not usually talked about in the way that we should. I'll carry my bag.
And to this point of systemic, our understanding of mental health, I think it's really important to impress upon ourselves is that it's still a very young science. The National Association for Mental Health wasn't able to push forward legislation that treated it on a federal level until 1947. And so what that means, although we might think of that as ancient history in some sense, because maybe, for whatever reason we're removed from it, it still means that our efforts to treat it are less than 100 years old, which is still within the lifetime of one person. I was having a conversation before this in advance, and it's really interesting to note the generational divides in our perception of mental health, where I think previous generations are coming to overcome the stigma of it and just being able to connect with one another and share their own experiences and finally broach the topics of shame that might have prevented the stigma of speaking out and admitting this sort of weakness within yourself. It's very interesting to see that the teens of our age, the young kids that are in high school, elementary, are very casually talking about what mental health looks like for them on social media platforms like TikTok. People are creating entire public personas based on their relationship to mental health and on how they navigate their own experience of that. But I think it's just important that we also recognize that evolution where an older generation might look at them and maybe say, to cry as the derisive terms like snowflakes, etc., for creating this vocabulary of pronouns or these new terms that define these very niche micro experiences. What we're actually doing, I think, is witnessing humanity sort of bloom and come into this form of expression where it can name its own experiences, and as we are able to name them, we can treat them more scientifically and give people not just a sense of identity, but also a great sense of power in how they navigate and treat them. It's all about agency and making sure that you have the power to kind of express your own situation.
So how we do that right now is the question, how we do that in our community. It's going to be that mentorship, and usually mentorship doesn't look like the way that it should. It looks like we'll bring you on and then we're going to have you do a whole lot of work and not really explain to you what's going on and throw you into all these different activities for you to take on. And instead it should be an actual guide, so they should be teaching you how to be a leader in our community. If you're coming to these events with somebody that you work with that is in the older generation that has done this many, many years, it gives you an opportunity to see how you're supposed to be networking with the older generation. Because that's where you're going to get your jobs, right? It's 76% of the job market is hidden. So you actually need that networking. If you're in an LGBTQ, this is how you find safe environments to work in, because networking lets you know I'm somebody that welcomes that community without any stigma. And that's going to be also diverse groups in any racism and systemic racism that's out there. You're going to find that in your workforce. So if you're coming out and you are experiencing these networking times, these opportunities to talk about these things, you're finding the safe spaces for you to be able to exist as a person. That way you're able to grow and become that leader in our community that we need so much. Because your voice is extremely valuable. Everybody's voice in here is extremely valuable. And it lets everybody know that they are able to do what we do. Talk, go out in front of people, be out in the community, shake hands, and let them know your personal story. Personal stories have power and weight behind them, especially when it comes to mental health. It lets individuals know that if you've achieved this, if you've experienced trauma, if you come from this background, they can do it too. One of the biggest things that's talked about is representation in movies and TVs, on stages. And you need that. And if you're going to have that, you're going to have to take that step. It's taking that risk and understanding that risk is valuable. That risk lets you know that even if you fall on your face, you will be able to make it. Because it's all a learning experience. It's a journey, right? It's not a sprint. We're taking the time to get to know what it is to have our voices and to be empowered.
One time a friend was very down and kind of suffering from imposter syndrome and trying to figure out, I've been elevated to this new role. I'm trying to understand how I do this. A lot is being expected of me, things that I've never done before, and I'm just kind of winging it. And I was very sort of, and I just kind of said, well, another word for winging it, is flying. And what Kristie said about falling on your face, something that's really keen to impress upon young people, and people in general really, is that failing is a part of the process. And whenever we don't name that, whenever we don't create or facilitate a process that incorporates the natural failures that accompany our growth, it predisposes people to internalize their feelings of shame, which can compound feelings of mental health. This kind of sense of inner prohibition that stigmatizes your own feelings before you can even share them. And we know so much that, or I think one of the biggest things about leadership is that it can be so central into overcoming some of the different things, the factors that contribute to mental health, just because inherent to this aspect of leadership is the notion of community. You don't lead and you don't need no one. And something that we talk about a lot with organizing is that the goal of our movements is not just to become great leaders, but to create leaderful movements. You want to create the conditions where anyone who hears you, anyone who comes in contact with your story, in contact with your work, also comes in contact with the skill set and, much like Kristie said, the vision, the example of how to understand and do this for themselves. So it's about how is it that you sort of decentralize these coveted notions or ideas of power or status and impress upon people that these are just tools to change our conditions and make something that is more equitable and fair for all of us and accessible, that anyone might be able to take them upon for themselves and create a world or fashion a world that is more caring and considerate of their specific story, their humanity, because our definitions of what we understand ourselves to be are constantly expanding. And I think part of being human and part of being a leader is being committed to the growth of other people and accepting them for who they are within that growth. People come from all different walks of life. It's impossible to be universally relational to everyone, but part of the understanding your own story and is holding that sense of empathy for other people that might have a different opinion, but just a different experience than yourself.
To add on to that would be collaboration, right? Collaboration and understanding in that empathy actually is how we turn these movements into something that actually changes our world, right? And I think that's what we all need and what we all want, is that we're understanding the narrative that our society has spun is not healthy for anyone within our society, whether at the top level or the lowest level. Nobody's acknowledging their mental health. There's extreme dependency on a lot of professions that are in something that our society counts as important, or they've made it, they make money. Doctors, lawyers, all have dependency issues, at least a majority, not all. They have dependency issues, as well as our teachers. We don't give people enough credit that we have not within our society allowed mental health to be a part of the talk until now, until the pandemic. And in understanding that NAMI's been around for a lot longer than the pandemic, but we're just now really recognizing NAMI's ability and skills, what NAMI can offer, all the classes that they're able to give, peer-to-peer is one of the best ones to have in NAMI. Sacred.org, giving the resources. That is something that I know I personally needed in my life and in my experience 6 years ago when I had a very close family member lose touch with reality in an episode of psychosis. It affects everyone in the family. It affects your whole community, friends, family, support networks. And then you're questioning, wait, if they're having a mental health issue, you end up having one yourself. You're going through this experience with them, and it's a domino effect. So getting that education, getting that knowledge, getting that power, and then bringing it back into your community and talking about it, bringing it back into your own families and talking about it. If you were at the plenary that just happened inside the auditorium, then it's something that they talked about very highly. Start with your family first. Start with you first. If you want to be an advocate, that's where you start. You, then spread out to the other people around you. Because that's how you know that you're going to make a difference, is that you've already done it inside of yourself. That little voice that you talked about that tells you you're shame, you've got guilt, you've got something wrong with you. You've already got that under control. Our shadow selves, right? The part of us that we don't like to talk about or don't like to recognize that all of us have negativity. We end up being able to bring ourselves into the light, right? This is the faith conference, and in that we understand that the faith is that we bring that light and that shadow self into doing real powerful things. Then you're against your own voice and being like, I can do this. It's okay if I got anxiety. It's okay if I got stress. I can talk about these things, and I can talk about it openly, and I don't need to be ashamed. I don't need to have guilt, because we all experience a level of depression, anxiety, and fear.
Yeah. And those feelings, those negative feelings, the voices of the inner critic, your shadow self, the aspects of yourself that maybe are less favorable or less presentable that you might care for them to be, of course, they never really go away. And so as you foster a sense of compassion for yourself, it flexes that muscle, it develops that same sense of understanding so that you become more empathetic and you are more considerate of the mental health needs of people around you. And that's what we're really excited about in spaces like this, to see what is born of other people, to see what is born of not only our own, as we share our own struggles, but it's like how can we connect beyond the conversation? What does it mean to kind of create a long-term support system that exists within the community, not just as a resource, but as a real social net that people can tap into. We're here now, I was gonna say post-COVID, but hey, maybe someone argue we're still in the midst of it. But we're still at a point where we're allowed to be in person, and we understand how crucial it is to have that sense of connectivity, that sense of accessibility to other people, to overcome the sense of isolation that can compound those darker voices, those darker feelings that maybe can prey upon us if we're caught in isolation, if we're caught in uninterrupted patterns that maybe are not as healthy for us. It's all the more critical for us to be able to have that external perspective that can create a sense of a window of intervention where the other person can find support for themselves, can find understanding, can find solace, and something.
I think that really covers the general idea of what we wanted to bring forth in today's session. And really, we always wanted to open it up. We want to open it up to if y'all have questions specifically for us, if you would like us to elaborate on something more, go into something deeper. Please feel free. This is an opportunity for us to network and get to know what would you guys like to see more in the community. And since we are in leadership positions, that's what we've talked about, what Marlon has so eloquently stated, is that this is an opportunity to bring what ideas you may have to the forefront. We can help be those voices, that's the collaboration. And we can give that understanding that you also have that voice and power, point you in the right direction. Where would you like to go? We'll tell you what we know and where to go and how to bring this into your community.
I would say one last thing as a point of leadership. It's something that I constantly reacquaint myself with, is that part of leadership is that you are never ready to do it, but you consent to the process of trying, although Anne would probably say, another board member of Sacred, Anne Helmke, kind of like a guru for ourselves in addition to Billy as well. She says, she just told us yesterday, there is no trying, only doing, which is the wise words of Yoda parroted to her through her grandson, I believe. So now those words echo, reverberate, and touch upon you as well. But in that doing, it's understanding that you are consenting to a process of being transformed. When you assume a mantle of leadership, you're identifying a problem or you're conceptualizing, however creatively or procedurally, some sort of solution, and you're trying to implement that in a real way. And in the same way that you transform the space that you're navigating or the work that you're doing, you were changed by it yourself. And I think sometimes other people see that maybe before you are ready to, or maybe to accept the full height of it. And I know for young leaders especially, as people sort of transition from that juncture of late adolescence into full adulthood, sometimes people can sort of psych themselves out in the same way that I've had conversations with friends, conversations with Kristie as well, we talked about this. It's all about kind of creating that sense of support so that you are able to combat your own inner critic, so that you do not disqualify yourself or allow yourself to fall prey to, again, that inner critic or those negative voices. And I guess with that being said, we had initially conceived of this being maybe a little bit of a longer presentation, but given that we are more intimate, and the point of this is about connectivity, we are sincerely interested in hearing of your own experiences and seeing what it is that we can do to kind of connect, again, so that these conversations do not end here, but translate to real meaningful change. And that's not to say that you have to have these very grandiose, well thought out ideas. That's not at all. We're all here for incomplete ideas. There's no such thing as perfection. We're here to develop that together, even if that means it's just like a specific intervention within your own life. Because as Kristie said, it starts with your family, it starts with yourself. So initially, this idea was going to be something of a yearbook. The idea was that we would sort of graduate you all as the young leader class of 2022 here at Pathways to Hope. And part of the yearbook would be that you sign, kind of commit to one another. If someone has a specific idea about a project that they want to mount or a specific kind of program or idea, something that they want to learn more about, you feel free to kind of come around and sign it so that each of you can exchange contact information, but also so that the holder of each yearbook has the practice of being a leader that can then kind of take ownership of this information, take ownership of the connections that they make today, and of course connect with us as well. We're here to support you within this process. If you want myself or Kristie or even Billy, who's also a member of Sacred, to sign your yearbook and talk about what it might mean to move beyond just a simple conversation with young leaders engaged in mental health, or if you want to just talk a little bit more about it, we really want to open the floor to make this a little bit more conversational and cross-collaborative here if we can.
If you've got an idea, no idea is a small idea. It's an idea that can get the ball rolling.
I have an idea. Being from the older generation and being raised up in a family that didn't talk about mental illness, you know, there were those jokes like, oh, you know, there's crazy Marlon, or, you know, she's touched, but it wasn't talked in the home. And so growing up, not talking about that kind of stuff to anybody. You didn't talk to your family about it, you didn't talk to your coworkers, your best friend, a lot of times not even your spouse. I think that's a part that we might be able to work on, is maybe passing the torch, you know, from the older generation of leaders that have been working in this area to the new generation of leaders coming up, because I know that I'm not up to y'all's way of talking, the new kids, the technology. You know, I hate Zoom. I can do almost anything in front of a big group, but put me in front of a camera and I'm just like nothing. You know, I don't want to move, much less anything else. So maybe that would be something to have, like a group passing the torch to the young ones, maybe getting the older generation and newer generation leaders that are coming up. They're going to be coming out of these conferences to have that session where, you know, they can tell them, well, I started out as a mediator or, you know, this, and now I'm the CEO of this company and stuff like that. So,
I think that would be extremely empowering, right? I think that's our ultimate goal, is to be able to have those citywide collaborations where, you know, the community leaders that are already out there, our district council people, are actually coming into the group in conversations on how they got started, what their stuff is about, where you can go to become that person. And if anybody has any ideas, right, we would love to put that forth out into the people that we are connected with, because that would be the ultimate session, is to be able to have that passing of the torch in a way that doesn't allow the torch to burn out. Because I think in my experience and what I know about our society, it has. It has, and we need to relight the fire. Sorry.
not only that, sometimes the older leaders like myself don't know how to pass the torch when we know it's time to pass because we've done it for so long.
You know, I actually have a lot of compassion for our predecessors, the people that came before us, that kind of laid the foundation for the path that we can now walk, where we can have maybe a more ambitious conversation about what it means to address mental health and maybe even what our concept of mental health is. Circling back to what we said before, you mentioned, you know, when you were younger, there was the language of such and such family members that was almost touched. When you said that, it reminded me, I had like a very visceral memory of like my own family using that same kind of language. But I think it ties into what I was trying to say a little bit more about these younger generations now having this broader array of terms to speak a little bit more accurately or maybe even more humanely in a way that still affords the subject of the conversation their full humanity, so that they're not this idea of a defective person or something that can't be helped. Now they can at least engage in a way that doesn't suspend the agency of that person. I had my nephew the other day, I overheard him on the phone. He's about 12 years old. He was on the phone talking to someone. He was like, bro, they're neurodivergent. It's not cool to say that about them. And I was like, what? You're neurodivergent? You're 12, you're in middle school. But so when we have these anxieties about, you know, the torch being passed or being extinguished, I think that hope, that flame is very much still alive, and I would argue in some ways brighter, but the problem is that we're not fully connected to one another. And in the same way that it takes a central path or support systems to develop as leaders, there is not that same sense of infrastructure in place to kind of, for young kids to begin to interrogate the relationship to it. Although it is happening in a very informal way on social media, that's not to say it's something that's fully vetted or altogether standardized, you know, that can lead to very erratic solutions, but it is a step forward. But again, I think I would encourage all of us to remain optimistic about the fact that we are only really beginning to have these conversations. You know, depression wasn't formally recognized as like a federal investigation or policy passed until like the 1980s or so. And when we kind of break down the smaller ways that, you know, race or gender or sexuality might also compound upon those things, like for myself, I know that I want to say that the Black National Caucus did not partner with, I forget which mental health institution, but there wasn't like a formal study into the specific mental health litmus test of the Black community until like the 90s or so. So this is still a very, very young thing, and I think we should give ourselves some grace within that, because it means that there's a lot of ground left to break, and there's just a lot of work to do. I think we're on track for some really exciting things, and I'm excited to move forward with it.
Open-mindedness and optimism, I guess, is what's really going to get us to the next step. Because it's understanding that in that exchange of that collaboration, the younger generation can teach the older generation something, as well as the older generation teaching the younger generation something. And we don't usually give each other that space and that credit. We don't give that acknowledgement. And of course, one of the biggest leaders here in the mental health department, Doug Leach, right, has been doing this for years and years. And he has struggled and been called so many different things from his generation because of the stigma and not talking about it. But now he has laid the groundwork for here. So even through what is difficult, what is hard, what is your peers and the people that you are with telling you that this is not something to experience, your family members in certain cases, right? That's my own experience, is I've been questioned. Why are you doing mental health? That's not lucrative, right? You're not gonna have money doing that. No, it's passion. It's passion, and it's love for another person, no matter what their experience is, and allowing them into that space with you, and being like, I hear you, I feel you, I'm willing to experience this hardship together, so that you're not doing it alone. Because that is something that we expect from everybody in our society way too often. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do this. It's inside of you, it's not inside of me. That's your problem. It's all of our problem, because it affects our society. And we choose to look at it from a place that is individualism rather than collectivism. And I think that's what we can learn from other cultures. That's more of a culture that is Caucasian culture, right? Colonization. But from other cultures, the Black community, the Mexican community, they're all about collectivism. They're all about support of one another. But they still don't talk about mental health the way that they should. So if we could just understand that mental health is powerful and that we can learn something from each other in that exchange and give space to one another. We are all equal, and we have the opportunity to be that if we start to change the narrative, because it's not the truth right now, right? We're not all equal right now. So understanding that and being like, I'm here to help you get to the next level so that we can get to the next level together.
I think if there's no more question, just one more quick thing to add to that is another reason why it's so important to remain aware or to educate ourselves about the context of the fact that this is still a very young effort in us attempting to tackle mental health is beginning to track or connect the consequences of our actions or inactions. When we are not afforded the opportunity, I should say, to develop a relationship, a compassionate relationship with our own shadow self, our inner critic, our anxiety, when we're not allowed to hold space and really witness that for what it is and also understand the sources of where it comes from, I think that can be expressed in an unhelpful way. Maybe when you mentioned, for example, like Doug Leach receiving the criticisms from his peers of this or that derisive kind of term, I sometimes wonder, and I experience this, or I think about this as well in relationships when an older generation may be criticizing this newer one as snowflakes for some of like these, again, hyper-specific terms that help them process and understand and treat their own specific mental health needs. I think about that as a sense of like misplaced, I don't want to say frustration, but something like, well, what about me? You know, I think the underlying tone of that is, I didn't get help, and I made it to this far, so why do you need it? You know, this is not like a necessary thing. Mental health is a luxury in that way. And that's what I mean when I say that I have a lot of compassion for the predecessors that came before us, because in many ways, they were not as well resourced in this fashion. And I don't think that the solution for it now is to ignore that fact, but to now also resource them, because what would it mean for the peers of Doug Beach, the same ones maybe that have had less than favorable things to say about him, to admit their own struggles, to admit that, you know, I was attacking the shame. I was externalizing the feeling of shame about myself that I see in your story, that I was not strong enough, that I did not live up to the narratives that have been told my entire life about, you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have to be strong enough to cross this as a person. Crying is a weakness. You cannot show your weakness to other people. There are manifold narratives that we are consistently integrated into our programming and socialization that we are attempting to undo little by little in each of these conversations. And that's why it's so important to have that sense of social cohesion and connectivity from outside sources, because I think sometimes when we talk about our own sense of self-worth, it can be elective in the sense that you might feel good about yourself, you might have self-esteem one day, but maybe it's conditional based on you being a lawyer, based on you performing in this certain way, based on you having a specific partner or body type. And when you have that sense of validation, or when you can have this other person that can hold your humanity when you are not strong enough to carry it, or when you are briefly defeated by the internal anxieties that we all have, it helps you create the strength to carry on. Not only that, but to expand your sense of worthiness within yourself so that you are not so easily thwarted by those same demons as you move forward. And also to have to hold that and extend that same compassion for others when the time arises. We talked about representation before and how important that is for young people of color, queer people to see themselves represented in media. And I think just as something that is just as integral to that is modeling the process of connecting to other people, modeling processes of support. When you see or when you undergo training about what it means to support someone that is facing a mental health issue, you're essentially learning how to mimic this behavior that is being modeled by another party, how to follow these steps and feel more confident in asserting yourself in that moment. So, yeah.
Lean on one another. And if you have not been a part of Bridges to Care yet, you really should consider it, because it's free trainings and they give you that opportunity to be in that experience, be that companion for someone else, because it gives that empowerment to you. Your experiences are important. What you've gone through is important. And that gives you what Marlon has stated, that compassion for somebody else. Completely different experiences, but an understanding that we don't have to have the same background to love one another, to support one another. Yes.
I'll poke at you a little bit here. So I didn't realize all of this was so new, but I can look back at my wife's family has some history of mental health challenges, and they didn't have a language for it, right? And so now I look at in the present sense, what are we doing now? And I find my generation, I'm an old guy, right? We tend to be pretty sterile in what we write. And I think there's a lot of folks who are scared to talk about it because they don't know how to talk about it, whether that be race-related or mental health-related or whatever. I don't know how to, and so we end up with this politically correct neutral ground that says almost nothing. So how would you like to see us talk about mental health publicly? I'll put sacred in front since there's a few of us here from that. How would we put it out front? I think our mental health portal is awesome. It's frankly sterile too, right? It's very politically correct. What should we be doing?
Honestly, when I think about the question of what is the biggest problem facing our conversations around mental health, it's not necessarily the conversations themselves, because as we have talked about, the language is evolving. This newer generation, as things become less stigmatized, are finding more room to express and maneuver within their own agency, to name the problems so that we can more accurately diagnose and begin to treat them in a more empirical way. I don't think that we're failing in terms of talking about it necessarily. I think really we have to, and maybe this is a little bit more uglier and bigger than what the conversation is meant to be, but mental health is secondary to this question of our material conditions. You can have your access to a counselor, you can have the appropriate medication, but if you don't have food in your fridge, then it's like you're not fighting demons, you're not fighting depression, or your depression is secondary to the fact that you're underfed. So what I think could be really exciting is within this mental health connection, with mental health as the focus, if we could find institutions that serve to sustain and nurture human life, places like food pantries, places like our educational centers and schools, places like housing services, if there could be some sense of unified coordination in terms of what it looks like to treat the people that are seeking that need to stabilize their life, then we can begin to address the conversation of mental health. Because in the midst of ongoing crisis, as you've talked about, whether you're treating or supporting a family member or friend, there's only so much you can really do. And even with the training, it's like we're not we're not mental health professionals, and that's not the goal to create a lieutenant professional class of mental health. We're just trying to transform the broader condition so that people can ask for help without shame. And so that other people, as we're talking about these topics of mental health, do not treat it as something that is pathological or pathologize the people that suffer from this, because it is just another aspect of our health. So I don't know that the failure is in the way that we're talking about it. I think we just have to understand, again, that mental health is secondary to this question of our physical health, or not secondary, but it's a part of that. So when we're talking about the stress that we endure, if that's coming from, not having a job, being worried about the climate, this broader thing of, it's not a conversation, it's just an action.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead, then I'll ask.
I was just gonna act doing it in truth. Like if we're gonna talk about it in truth. Because we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing that we choose not to say anything at all. If you say the wrong thing, don't be offended when somebody asks you to correct yourself. That's the biggest thing. We immediately personalize it. Oh, well, that's gonna be negative talk. I'm wrong. I did this. I wasn't politically correct. I didn't use the right terminology. And doing that in truth just allows you to share that space with someone and allow them to share what they believe and what they believe is true. To be able to add more vocabulary to yourself and be like, okay, I will carry myself differently. Thank you for sharing that with me.
It takes a tremendous amount of courage to correct yourself.
I was just going to ask what role do y'all observe someone's faith playing into all of this, their Christian faith in God?
I believe all faiths play a really big role in our understanding of mental health, because there's a lot that happens, like with the case of psychosis. Many cases have a God complex in them. It's all of a sudden, I am God, right? And we're all little pieces of things, but they end up internalizing their spirituality in a way that is not healthy for their mental health, because they don't understand how to separate the two, right? And you don't really need to separate it as much as you do needing to understand that your spirituality is either something of faith that you believe in and you bring with you and put forth in everything that you do, or it's something that you're still grappling with, that when you're struggling with mental health is going to become the forefront of what you're talking about, because our community is so big about faith and about what spirituality you have, what religion are you. And usually that's going to come from culture. And they all share a very similar thread, no matter if they're Abrahamic religions, they all have a very similar thread. All the books are written the same. They all have the same information, but we don't talk about that. We talk about separation. Oh, well, you're not the same as me, right? If that's what you believe, that's not what I believe. But we all believe in this connectedness with one another because that's what we need. That's what we're here for, is to have that support with one another, to understand each other's struggles, and to move forward. That's a collective. So it plays a large role in their mental health if they have a faith that they believe in.
I think similarly, when you separate faith from trying to divide it down to maybe a specific sort of following, that it is ultimately like an informal and also formal belief system, but also system of community that constitutes support, both positive and negative, depending on your relationship to it. You mentioned Christianity, so I'll probably, if we're talking about just within the realm of Catholicism, right, you have this built-in practice of confession, where you can go and you can share this thing that is bothering you and be absolved of it. But with that also, you have this kind of counterpoint of the trope of Catholic guilt, right? So faith can be this really beneficial space for people where they can find community that helps them overcome some of the more heightened feelings of shame that they can suffer from when they're isolated or alienated in that way. But it can also be a double-edged sword if the actors within those communities, or even, I don't want to say this, it's not, just because the community is there doesn't mean that the support is going to be inherently there. And I think from a psychological standpoint as well, God is always going to be like an authority in that person's mind when you talk about faith. So it's about how do you relate to that, and in the same way that we balance our sense of an inner critic or whatever that kind of darker voice might be, what does it mean when you relate to this higher authority, the ultimate authority? How does that then impact your mental health if you are not, depending on how you kind of live up to or don't meet the standards of what that's your faith system stipulates you should be, like your lifestyle should be, how you should live your life, how you should dictate it. ultimately, I think faith can be a really supportive thing for people, but it's just a matter of communicating throughout it and consistently making sure that you have the room to express your pain without judgment and still be seen as a person.
If you believe there's a God and He really does love you and care about you, that's huge. I think.
Yeah.
I had a question, but you guys can ask that.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think really what the solution you're coming around to is a holistic approach.
Yeah.
You know, we're colleagues, I work at the American Sheriff's Office as a reentry technician. By no means of any kind of medical professional other than training, trauma and whatnot. But, I know that's my weakness, and that's an area that I try to evolve on. So for me, working with my guys, having been a case worker out there in the outside, I mean, exactly what you're talking about, resource living, back in 2012, I would have loved that something. I would have loved it, because I'm hunting around for food, clothing, shelter, correction. Me coming out in the field, the only thing that I didn't kind of follow was one of those higher basic needs. And that seems to have been the key there. And then it's kind of like the grapple around choosing criminogenic thinking. So that also is an area working too. We just change your thinking. I'm like, you have to do that for a hungry person, and then that needs to contribute to their mental health and why they're showing aggression. So
It's also like tangled. It's like all just so complex because for myself, I work beside Ryan in Third County Jail, and so it's like you can provide food for people to eat, but how do you know they're going to go find it themselves later? You can't make them eat it. So it's like you have to attack the person as a whole and try to do things kind of like what you said, like in line with each other. So focus on faith, focus on their needs, focus on their education. And then I think something that I went into a presentation yesterday, they talked about how individuals connected to churches, sometimes they kind of get that misconception of, okay, well, if I go to church, I need to just trust in God that He's going to take care of me. So you talk to a pastor or somebody there, but they're not always clinicians or LPCs or in the mental health field. So then they kind of get just, stuck on this side when really it's still the whole person. It's still, their spirituality, their mental health, their physical health. So something I was going to say, and I just have this crazy idea that I would really like to see there be like an annual mental health exam being kind of like implemented as children. So like every year, kids have to go in there and get a physical. They have to get a physical before they go to school. So my idea or my hope one day is that the system or like the higher federal, everybody above puts policies and says, okay, well let's do mental health checks every year or every 2 years. Make sure they see. But then on the other side, there's a concern because there's not enough psychiatrists. And then how are they going to treat them? So I feel like the world we have so much to work on, but we don't have the capacity or the educated individuals, and a lot of us are minority, and I'm also, in that same field, but I got my master's degree, I'm an LPC, I have worked in this profession like almost 10 years, so, but there's not enough of me either, so I'm like, how can we keep this trend or this wave going, because that's what I feel like is going to be the bigger piece of change, is kind of forcing it, like, you have to get, shots before you go to school. Well, you gotta go see the counselor before you go to school.
and go with the handoff.
Right.
I see too many times that's the poison pill to keep you from it. I may be a good guy to help you on this particular thing. For me, let's get up in the morning is actually helping former veterans go to careers. So I can't get them work ready, or I'm not going to send them out until they're work ready. That includes their mental health as their basic needs and that. So, I just say, this person, that's that we'll talk to, so here, well,
acceptable thing is anger. So if somebody's depressed, they're gonna lash out because it's more acceptable to lash out and angry and yell than to cry and curl up and need a hug. So that's what I found in the jail. I'm very passionate about going back into the jail and creating my own program to work on just that, mental health and substance use. But all of that doesn't come by itself. There's trauma. There's, like the hierarchy of needs. Nobody is connected to them anymore. So they've lost all of their family in the process. They hurt so-and-so. So it's like, how I want to just create a map and see, like, okay, like Brian saying, you do this, like, because it's everything.
Yeah.
There's so much need.
We could honestly have an entire talk just in response to what the two of you laid out, but I will try to be brief. I don't want to keep everyone here hostage. So there are a number of different things, right? When you talk about this question of how anger is the only acceptable thing to express, yes, that's very true. And it's also specific. Psychologists noted that it's especially true for men, which is why we see, this, I guess, predominance of like emotionally flattened men. Like from the time that you're a kid, you're taught, specifically for boys, that you're taught to kind of suppress your emotions. The only one that's really socially acceptable to express is anger. But of course, we also know from psychology that anger is a secondary emotion. So as you've already illustrated, that anger is always in connection to a separate thing, whether it's sadness, whether it's fear, whether it's anxiety. So it's all about this sense of protecting themselves from a preemptive threat that may not even be a threat at all. The threat may not be this sense of a violent person. It could be, as we talked about here, hunger, etc. And I really appreciate that both of you kind of affirmed a commitment to a holistic model of treatment that recognizes that even if you're changing what's happening up here, you still have to take care of the whole thing, because mental health is just one facet of health. We have to make sure that people are fed. We have to make sure that people are housed. We have to make sure that people feel good about the lives that they're leading, that they can envision a future, whether it's someone being qualified again or in recovery and looking forward to like a future job prospect as a professional where they can provide for themselves and their family. We have to create a sense of a pathway to the future that people feel that they have ownership of. And what I feel like is lost, I would caution, okay, two things. I really like your idea about having some sense of a standardized assessment for what mental health could mean. I would also just caution that in that something that we talk about in sociology is this idea of functionalism, which is that, this really great idea on the surface is wonderful and well-meaning and lovely and nice, but then if it's legislated and let's say that a low-income family has a kid that doesn't pass the mental health assessment because they can't feed their kid, then now they're in legal jeopardy and they can't also like fight off the legal jeopardy of proving to the court that they can take care of their child, because they actually can't. And maybe that's not necessarily through no fault of their own, but it circles back to this idea of escaping individualism and recognizing that the way that we tackle this is by tackling our most essential needs. And like mental health is secondary to a systemic or physical, material, actual need. And there was another thing, yes, this idea in my mind, it's less about instituting a specific policy and more about creating more opportunity for public goods to be good. When we talk about the development of cities, and even just in San Antonio, I'm sure if you've walked around downtown, if you've lived here for a little while, you can see that we are one of the most, our city has one of the highest homeless populations in the nation. And that is a direct result of some of the economic segregation that makes it so hard for people to attain housing in the first place, and makes it such a perilous place once you lose that footing within that specific industry, or not industry, so that specific need. But and specifically to the topic of like young leadership, when you have strong public programs, when you have lots of access to public space, which is very quickly disappearing in the development of current urban cities, it creates more opportunity for students or for young people to assert themselves, to discover themselves, to connect to these different actors and spaces where they can find more mentorship, where they can find a sense of purpose, where they can recognize that the only systems of support that they don't know whether they have, they can build systems of support that are meaningful and true to them beyond just their immediate family, beyond just their neighborhood, and they can escape that sense of kind of regional thinking that maybe, again, defeats their imagination where they have an opportunity to develop it. There used to be a really good program in San Antonio that I hear all the time about called Sanrio. And I don't know, maybe some of you heard it. It's called Sanrio. It was like a summer work program for kids, specifically from like the inner city back in like the 60s. and it was publicly funded, and it would line them up with summer jobs, and it would keep them out of being idle and board all summer, and they would also connect them to these different facets, different careers and spaces that they maybe would not have been able to attain on their own. But as much as we can, we need to connect our specific institutions, our specific different places, and create more of a living, active support system that is in constant communication with one another, so that if I come in contact and organizing with a young person that really wants to be involved with Bridges to Care, I can say, yes, here's my friend Kristie. Please, let me connect you two. Let's get you involved. Let's get you as a volunteer. They need to be able to not only see for themselves, but then also live the experience out in a way that is low risk and supported, so that they can build that sense of confidence and learn how to just be an adult.
So you were definitely speaking my language, and before we move on to the next question, because I too feel that we need to have, they have to have dentists. The children have to have dentists. They have to have doctors, especially if you're federally funded, if you're using a Medicaid program, or if you're using something, they force you to have to do that. Why don't we do the same with mental health? You know, like just a year checkup, just being like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Going through the language that we need to talk about our emotions at a very young age. You know, they're introducing that more and more into the school system. So it's looking at it from not only a holistic view, but a humanistic view. Because everybody experiences life in a different way. And understanding that family unit doesn't need to be taken apart, it needs support.
Right.
So that's where we need to start, and understanding that our programs are a little bit broken in that. And we just need to reintroduce the fact that everybody has struggles, and there may be something that needs to be given to those parents that can better support their children, so that they understand they're not being supported, they aren't eating. Whatever little food they do have, they do give to their kids. So they're going to keep going with that cycle. And that's not going to change if you take the child out. That can actually cause more trauma. You know, so in reintroducing that, it needs to be looked at from case-to-case basis, from a humanistic perspective. How do we introduce that into how we write our programs?
Well, this is just add one thing, because you know, before the pandemic, we did a lot of hard work in group sessions, but because of the pandemic, we switched to a video visitation system, which Bear County, 21 counties in Texas, it actually does the visitation. The inmates don't see their families face to face. Yesterday, back in the day, before they changed to that, but now it's been very beneficial, because we're meeting with them one-on-one. You get to have that conversation and then really build up that person. As we try to pivot around COVID, we introduce folks to the setting, trying to be cautious. In doing these things, you know, it's helped them, I think, develop a sense of agency. They feel more connected to the people that we're going to send them out to for resources. So, you know, I've talked to my higher ups, and I'm really interested to see once we start looking at recidivism 3 years from now, what our numbers are going to look like. You know, I think that everything, you know, that you've been saying, we've been talking about here throughout the conference makes sense. And it's really hoping that will be something positive on our
And I think as you mentioned, as far as like connection or connecting the families to what services that they need, because even for me, like I said, I've been in the mental health field for a while, and I'm very open with my kids. You know, we talk about everything. They know everything from justice side to like just being human and crying and expressing your emotions. But even for me, my daughter disclosed that she felt suicidal last year. So even as acceptable as it is, we talk about it, my daughter's struggling with depression. That doesn't mean that I'm not a good mom or I'm not caring for her needs. It's just that her experience as a person it's traumatic for her. And if I look at it based on the way I grew up, I'm like, I don't have like food and water or a restroom. You know, I have to go to the store to go to the restroom. So it's like very individualized, and we just don't know what that person is not because of their family. They were kind of, you know, put together and conditioned by the people around them, but in the world, but it's still them. They have their own unique, like God created everybody so unique that we can be in the same place and still not experience the same thing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that just the fact that you were able to talk about that at all with your daughter, that she feels secure in sharing it, is a really fortifying thing. And specifically your awareness that you know that it's not reflective of a personal failure, that this is really just something that is indicative of the experience of the times. We have not forgotten about this question here in the back. I do want to applaud you as well. I just really want to quickly say that I think sometimes when we conceptualize the young people coming up, telling us about their specific needs in a very hypersensitive way, or a way that we perceive to be hypersensitive, it can sometimes be disqualifying of what human potential can really mean, right? So if we take mental health just on the surface of it being a health issue, like we are both actually people that are wearing glasses right now. Technically, in that regard, you can classify glasses as a physical disability. What would it mean if life never created the conditions to foster, or what would it mean if we never created the conditions to foster lives that can succeed despite the fact that they are physically handicapped in this specific way? I think we should recognize the sensitivities of mental health in that same way. We have to create conditions where these people can not only live but thrive, because we need them. We need everyone moving forward. And did you want to add, or do you? Perfect.
So my thing, what I've seen is I want inside the districts more mental health professionals, and the reason why I say that is because I'm tired of hearing like, oh, there's not enough in the budget to hire someone with mental health background. So we have counselors and we have social workers, yes, but most of the time is that they're focused on the academic side, which is more like grades, credit recovery, that the counselors don't have time to see those individuals. So if you have a student that's going through an issue at home or a mental health situation, they are being told like, oh, you have to come back. So no longer do we have that support system, I feel, inside the school districts to say, hey, I'm going through this at home, or they're too busy, or we're like don't have enough teachers or whoever, and they just see it as like little Johnny's in the hall, go to class, you know, or go to ISS. I already seen you, instead of taking that time and say, okay, little Johnny, what's the matter? What's going on? Or so I want to see like more of that, more community engagement towards activities towards these young youth, because a lot of them are experiencing anxiety and depression that they state. And it's like more like, oh, well, we're all going through that, but there's nothing to engage them in activities outside the community. There's a lot of them, yes, of course, but nobody has took initiative to say, hey, let's take them out to the park. And when we do, it's seen as like, why are you rewarding the child that they call like the bad kid, or the kid that's going through a mental health or a situation at home? It's being looked at as more like, oh, well, why are you rewarding the kids? Not that we're trying to reward them, it's more like trying to engage them to do an activity so they could trust that individual, trust more people to say, hey, I'm going through this right now. So that's just my idea, that I want to see more like a mental health professionals inside the districts, school districts, or more as a more community engagement with the young youth.
And taking, and getting.
She wants to see more mental health professionals involved within schools, and also beginning to eradicate ideas of maybe punitive, like withholding privileges, like going to the park for kids that maybe are acting out, people that are in ISS. She wants to see more of a holistic model that treats them in that way, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
And sadly, not letting them go to the park isn't fair, because being in nature can be very healing
Yes.
too.
Yes.
Retreat.
Okay.
I'm just curious, as attending the conference here, I've noticed that y'all as speakers and leaders of NAMI and Sacred, that y'all are probably the youngest team that I've seen here. Maybe not, I don't know. But that's what I would like.
We'll take it, we'll take it.
That's what I would like to know. What is Sacred and NAMI do within their own community to reach out to our community, to pull in people like y'all, the young people, to come in, because y'all are the ones that are going to take the torch and run. But we need to be able to have someone to pass it to. Do y'all have programs within your own community to say, hey, you know, I've got so-and-so and he wants to be a CEO, maybe come talk to this guy in our community. And are the young people interested in this?
I say they're very interested. But right now, we kind of are it, right? Like them putting us into this position where we are, allowing us to take that space with them, is that they're asking us for our input. How do we bring more people like you into the community? That's why we've put on this today, as well as we've done this at the intersection, which is actually how we met one another. And now we've kind of, I told him that day, oh, you're never gonna get rid of me now, right? We are partnered together for life, all right? We're gonna go through this with one another because you met someone that's on the same vibration, on the same wavelength that you are. bring them forward. Having that community and that support is really important, having that socialization. And so that's kind of a catch that we run into a little bit, is like, there is no groundwork for this right now. So they're asking us to lay that groundwork, right? How do we bring in the younger generation? Because they do want it. There's so many younger generation that are like, yes, I will do that, let me do it. And all we need is for them to be around and to give information, exchange information. We'll pull you into the next conference. You know what I mean?
I will say very quickly that there are opportunities for younger people to be engaged, but they're not coordinated and they're not in communication with one another. And in the same way that our public programs have declined, those opportunities have declined. So I mentioned Sanrio very briefly earlier. That's one of many programs that has been eradicated. It used to be funded by the city, and we've seen a consistent decline of funding to education. But education, again, is like secondary. Schools are just one of many public spaces. We can also create these same opportunities within parks if there are enough of them, if there were walkable cities. I think what we're talking about ultimately is recognizing public space as an opportunity for discovery and making sure that we are, as best as we can, populating that with helpful institutions that are in communication with one another in the fashion of a broader infrastructure that has explicitly stated amongst itself that we want to develop kids, we want to develop people for specific roles. I think when we talk about, you mentioned, I think, I want to be, if there's a kid that says I want to be a CEO, I don't know of anything for like young kids, but I know that in high school, places like the Lift Fund might go out of their way to foster in different mentorship programs. But of course, high school might be too late. By that point, if a kid has already internalized ideas that, I'm not good enough in this or that way, my grades aren't good enough, I'm not going to make enough money in this, or my family doesn't make enough money to afford that, it can be very hard to overcome that programming. I think it really just depends on us engaging in a very young level as best we can. And in my mind, my highest imagination is that the schools are like this dual support role as not only schools themselves, but also community centers where people can go and receive assistance for housing, for food, for school counselors to be actual counselors and not just managers of like class credit. I think that's really where I would like to go, and not altogether impossible to get there. And also, I have not forgotten about your question, or your initial idea. When you were, the question back about creating more mental health, or putting more mental health professionals within schools, I totally support that. I think that would be really phenomenal, even if kids had within their schedule, maybe every quarter you have at least however many allotted counseling sessions with this therapist that can help process and intervene, so that before you get to the point where someone is feeling suicidal, you can identify that very early on, connect them with resources and a support system that circumvents them from internalizing that or acting upon it or projecting it onto other students in a really harmful way. I want to say, because it looks like more people are raising their hand, which I'm so excited about. If you have ideas, please do. If you have not already collected one, collect a yearbook. And please write it down, and I will be more than happy to sign it and be available to you in terms of facilitating the next steps, because again, we don't want the conversation to end here, so if you have not already, please pick this up and sign it.
We have a high reliance on funding, right? That's the biggest thing. We're even short on funding with NAMI right now, which is going to undercut the Bridges to Care. Sometimes, as much as we need the money and support, it's also the people that are willing to volunteer their time, right? That's the most valuable thing that we have. There's a program out there that will go around, and it's all dentists that get together a couple of times out of the month, and they'll go out into the homeless community and do dental work, free of charge. Sometimes we need that to really make change. So it's having the mental health professionals that have that passion, and they're like, yep, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to go out and I'm willing to help in the places that we need it until we can get that funding, because then it's allowing everybody to understand this is something worth putting their money into. So making that donation, going to sacred.org and making a donation, going to NAMI and making a donation, and being like, I believe in this. I believe in this so much that I'm gonna give $5 or $1, whatever I have to put forth to it, because any little bit is worth that investment in not only yourself but in your community. So that's something that, it's going to be hard to find those people that are really passionate about it and be like, I will donate my time to the school to be able to volunteer and talk as an LPC. I'll sit with the students, I'll do group sessions, once a week so that they can have that time to socialize and understand that they're in that community together. Oh, you experienced that? I didn't know that. You're an all-A student. I'm like a D student. And we share that.
Yeah.
So then it's creating that community and them understanding nothing happens in a vacuum. We all experience these things. And it's only the way that we put that expectation on ourselves that we think that we're the only ones, right? Like that I can't talk about this because I'm the only one. I'm gonna be the only one that experiences this. And then understanding like, oh no, you're not. This person outwardly seems like they've got it all together, probably does not. They constantly question it.
Very quickly, can you please raise your hand if you do have a question? I just want to make sure that we don't miss anyone. We have 3
I just have
here,
a real quick comment.
2 here. Okay. Quick comment, and then we'll go to you, and then you, and then come back over here. If that's okay?
And just to be picky, I totally agree, it's great if we reach out to kids when they're younger, but when they get older in high school, it's not too late.
It's never too late.
It's never too late.
Adulthood's not too late, right?
Lots of times that's who they're, middle school and high school is the time when they're figuring out who they want to be. Too.
Yeah.
So anyway, just to.
No, thank you.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to just, can y'all hear me over there? Okay. One of the things that I think would be very, very key, West Care actually funds the British Care programs for them. And so we would be interested in helping you all as well. But I'm saying that with understanding that is one component piece. This past summer, we worked with 198 young people, and we worked with them in terms of working in the community. But as a part of their work, there was lots of training that they received on mental health and doing those kinds of things. And I'm saying that simply because we got millions of dollars for workforce development, and our city completely forgot or left out youth employment programs. I'm saying that because as we talk about what engages and brings people to us, we have in our zip code 282, 203, 207. These are the poorest districts, not just in San Antonio, but in the country. And we act like, volunteering is wonderful, it's great, and if you've got a middle class lifestyle, then that works really well for you. Your mom can take you here and there. We have so many young people that doesn't apply to. And I think if we routinize this, make this routine, such that this is work that our young people do, but we value them by helping to pay them as youth employment, I think you will see both engagement and consistency. I'm not just saying pay them, because what we saw with these young people, when they were able to get a check every week, it changed some trajectories in some of their lives, but it changed how, it just changed things for them. For the first time they set up bank accounts, but by the time they did it, they could do things. And I see a lot of head shaking, but volunteerism is absolutely wonderful, we need to do it, but I think we also need to value, because we continue to think volunteerism is an upper middle class term, and I'm not saying that only those who do that. I'm simply saying I'm started there because everybody else had to work. Okay, so I'm just simply saying we need to recognize the continuum that people are on in their life and bring this to the table and actually see if we can't work with the mayor to open up those pots. All the millions of dollars they completely forgot our youth. And we are competing, and I can speak for this because I'm competing in the east side and the west side for those kids. I'm competing with drug dealers, I'm competing with gang members, I'm competing with nefarious sources. I need to be able to beat them out. This summer, I beat them with 198 kids.
When we value them, they value themselves. And so that is definitely, having that income, especially if they didn't have it, because that's where they're going to go is in their fair. It's easy money. So having something put into place that we understand that, and that there's a need in that. Because
I look forward to working with you guys as we move forward.
I also would like to add, that is amazing because I work a lot with the immigrant youth population. Our kids, sometimes they have to work to provide for their family. So it's not that they're being a bad kid and not wanting to go to school, is the Maslow's hierarchy of need. I need food, I need shelter, I need safety before anything. I love that. I love that.
And then food for families, I will tell you, not only do they get breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but every weekend we gave them a huge box of food to take home so it would last them over the weekend. I'm telling you, that we're competing for the basic necessities that they can get elsewhere.
Are you connected to the juvenile? Do you work with the juvenile?
Sure, to West Care.
Sorry, are you
West Care.
connected with the juvenile also? With everything?
I'm sorry,
with the Justice Department, juveniles? Are you
did we work with juvenile justice? I will tell you, we took in children from, we didn't ask any questions. We didn't turn anybody down, and I also didn't kick anyone out. And I will tell you, there were some of our trainers who felt like our kids were just bad and they were Bebe's kids. But I said to them, they said, well, we want to come back and work with you in the after-school program. I said, no, if you're out now, you're out. I said, because we have to be the village for these kids. They don't have one. We are who has to stand in that doorway. And so we did, I know, and answer your question, I didn't go to juvenile justice department to get kids, but I do know that we had many of them who worked with us during the summer. And we didn't kill them.
I know, me too.
Yes, go sign up for the T-Books. Sign up for the T-Books right now. I love the idea of our investment in children being both literal and figurative, so thank you so much for sharing that. I think we had one more question over here, and then we'll bounce back.
It was kind of like a collaboration between a lot of ideas. I'm a recreation therapist, and so I'm not sure if anyone knows what field that is, but we also work in school systems, and I don't know if anybody else works in school systems. And I know we talked about underfunding and the reliance on counselors that don't have the ability and capacity to be a counselor for the entire school, or maybe there's a counselor for the entire district, and it's just not feasible. But I was also thinking that maybe we could do a teacher certification, and there is someone teaching health, mental health, like there is for physical health. And so we can go over coping skills and suicide awareness and certify the kids to not only CPR certified like we do in healthcare classes, but QPR certified. And I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but caution, persuade, and refer. So it's suicide awareness. You look for signs and stigmas, because if we can't rely on counselors and administration to do it, then we have to bring it to the school system and say, maybe we can volunteer an hour a day for a class, for a quarter, whatever it looks like. So it's qualified to be in that position for our youth. So yeah, I mean, I really talked about having a master's and being a minority. I get it. And the reason we don't have a lot of minority in master's positions is because of the clinical internship, and it's unpaid, and that's weeding out a lot of the people, a lot of the applicants. And so I think maybe there could be something body-wise where we need legislation and we do student loan forgiveness for specific track clinicians. If you are going to work in a school, then we need you. And it's not to say that, you have less clinical time or hours or intern, because all of it's important, it's necessary, but just maybe something on the financial side with the loan forgiveness. And I don't know, just putting those ideas out there.
Right on the dome.
Our collective voices are going to be the most powerful, right? If we're going to want that change, we got to get, as much as we talked about anger not being the greatest thing and it's not usually accepted, we got to get angry enough to bring it to our policymakers. Yes, that's right.
I'm not disrespecting you all as an audience, but you look so comfortable sitting down. To answer your question, I don't personally work within education, but I was raised by 2 teachers. And I know that one of the latest things that they're implementing, they both teach on the east side, so they're like right in the heart at SAISD. My dad is at St. Houston, my mom is at Davis. And something that they talked about, and this kind of goes to something that's been mentioned before about a communal aspect in education or fostering good within our public goods. They talked about implementing a restorative justice program so that it's not all about a punitive system when someone does act out when they're not in ISS, where they have facets to meditate, facets to break down, and talking about interrupting models that are not about, again, pathologizing someone as a baby's kid or a bad person, but connecting with them and understanding that, the violence that this person inflicted upon me was not personal and was in fact symptomatic of something that they're already suffering from and dealing with themselves, and maybe it wasn't fair for them to do it, but now as we can kind of name it, I can move forward unhindered by the idea that I have lost value in some way, or that there was something about me that invited this kind of violence. And I think it's also really important to remember that our language around violence is constantly evolving, and not just within the question of mental health, but in other instances. And this is still like a new thing, but I totally agree. And I said, to write it down. I'm completely serious. Please write down your ideas so that we can each sign and follow up, and so that this conversation does not end here. But yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
I think this is something that we're really going to have to pose to Sacred and to other boards that we're a part of, to be able to be like, hey, can we throw something, once a month that we can have these people get together and we can, what are the top 5 things we could get out there right now? What are the things that we could back and bring in that kind of community where our voices are collective and we are able to make that change, because that's the only way it's going to happen. And righteous is better than anger.
One more question is, Registic care for adults only? Is that something you can take?
And we are actually in the talks of bringing it to the high school level, and the idea is that we put forth, and I'm really passionate about, is train them in the trainings. They train middle school trains elementary school. So then they all have those peer leaders already in there that can have those social support groups.
They already have a report, they're going through the same thing at the same time.
I guess it feels weird to me because it's where I was in the Alsagar originally, and we had something like that set up, and that was back in high school. So, I'm surprised they're saying someone doesn't have some of these things in small cities.
Really, I think a lot of the change happened with the pandemic. That's where Bridges to Care kind of came out of. That's where Sacred kind of came out of, is realizing there's a need and we need to meet that need and we're not meeting it fast enough. Where do we implement these changes and where do we put that information out for people to grab and be able to look up by their zip code in Sacred, where they can find that support near them, whether it's housing or whether it's, social support groups. But the youth is often not forgotten, but secondary to the adults in the community. And they're really what we need to put our value and our time into, because they're going to be even below, like they're next to us. So like we may be the next leaders right now, but we can start bringing somebody with us to these things too, that want to follow us around and want us to, talk to them about things, want to have our phone numbers so that they can call us and have that support so that we can foster that growth now. And they can be the person that is already going to surpass us and replace us,
Very quickly, I know we had some hands over here. I also don't want to forget your question, but we've been neglectful with this side of the room. So we're going to move over and I'll come right back to you. I'm so sorry. Sure.
I just wanted to say I'm a mental health counseling master's student at UTSA. We do have a school counseling track as well as clinical mental health counseling. I'm about to go into my internship at Veterans Affairs right now, but all I can say is, as counseling students, we're ready, we're excited to get out into our communities. There's a lot of passion there that I can say, from my fellow students. And we are sharing resources. I've sent the card, I took a picture of the Sacred card and sent it to multiple people already. So help is coming, and I just wanted people to have that hope that there are people that are learning how to do this and ready to get out of the community and passionate about it.
Thank you for doing that. So as someone that just graduated from my program at Texas A&M, it takes a lot to go through that program, and I did it at the height of the pandemic. So our own isolation, our own imposter syndrome, our own struggles, and our own suicidal ideation was very real with a lot of my peers. And so having to go through that and read those books, you have to start to heal yourself, and you have to bring that to the forefront. And so I brought Bridges to Care to Tamusa. If you'd like to bring it to UTSA, I think that that'd be a great resource, because then Bridges to Care, in collaboration with Sacred, can bring us out into the community faster. Giving them that support and being like, oh, this person wants to be involved. But it is very real that just as our youth need, so do we, right? I've got a family, I've got 2 kids. And it's really hard to do those internships and be like, we're not getting paid. We're not having the funds that we need for our life and our support. And so you have to be passionate about it. So thank you for doing it, because it's something that comes from the heart. And hopefully there is more, because the more I talk about it, the more I see it, the more I realize there is a lot more of us out there. And there's going to be people that want to do it, that are like, I don't want to go into debt doing it. So where is paying for that? And we've talked about that at Bridges to Care. How can we fund people's educations? You know, like it would be great if we could have Bridges to Care hubs in all districts where they have clinicians there, they have the resources there, and we've talked about that, but it all comes down to funds. Where is the funding to be able to do that? So it is coming. It is coming. Hopefully in the next 10 years we're going to see a growth, but I would like it to be in the next couple months. You know, like if we can just get something started.
Sign each other's yearbooks.
Yeah, I've been working in the school districts. I'm a UTSA student for social work, graduating in December, and then also with the teaching aid. So I'm doing the social work in the schools in East Side, and then working with the teaching aid too. And something I heard, and then earlier in my notes was that dialogue and that narrative, and a big barrier that I feel like I'm hitting a lot is, so when I have a problem student and I am taking them out to work with them, and it's, you know, many of the teachers, it's like I'm rewarding them, you know? And so something I would love to hear more about, have more dialogue about is how, because these are also my colleagues, right? Like I'm working in the school, I am making relationships and sharing those resources and stuff. So I'm really walking that fine line of not, you know, I don't want to talk about trauma-informed parent ACEs and be like talking down to my colleagues. That's not appropriate. But I also am like what I've heard from y'all. Like I don't take these kids out, like sure these are kids who are starting fights and throwing desks and, you know, this behavior is out of control, but the way that I'm working with them is relationship building, you know, and giving them the resources that I can, and taking them to the park, or, you know, like these things that I've heard. And so the teachers are like, you know, and I'm like, I'm really struggling with how to bridge the gap between us, I suppose, and like how that narrative plays into that. Yeah, and I'm very aware of towards
This experience is secondary to my own, but in conversation with my dad, as he's kind of tried to facilitate those models of interrupting punitive systems, and he has also shared that there's been some pushback from teachers that feel similarly, like, well, why is it that they are not being punished? Because they don't see like this exercise of a student venting or meditating and then having a dialogue with one another as something that's altogether constructive. Because again, that's separate and alien to the experience that these people who are adults have had and how they have been, how their own needs and lashings out have been met. So you're asking them to kind of conceptualize something beyond themselves. I think, and I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers with it, but I think you can only really do what you can do in terms of controlling your class, your students, the one that you're responsible for. And if your model, if your system is, if you're rewarding them, turns out that the person or the student in question, it becomes that their behavior improves, that your relationship improves, that they're able to confide in you about things, not just about school, but like, well, you know, Miss so-and-so, this is really bothering me. If they even apologize to you at one point, I think that can be evidence that you go back and take back to the teacher, not as a sense of confronting them, but saying like, look, you know, this thing does not work right away. I'm not saying it does, but because I've been patient in this way over the past month, over the past 2 months, by the end of this term, I have this relationship with the student where now I have trust, and they are sharing with me about these deeper things, and I'm able to change and interrupt or intervene in their life in these meaningful ways, or refer their parent to this or that service. I think that in and of itself could be compelling, so that you don't have to have the argument or talk down with them, but literally just point at the evidence and say, this is what I'm doing, this is how it is working. If you would also like to do this, I think it could be really helpful for your kids, and I would also want to help you in doing it, because I know that it's new. We had a conversation before, I think you mentioned about, you know, about it's changing up here. We have a really good authority that from psychologists, practice like meditating and rearranging the synapses in your brain and like the common pathways of your neurons. It takes at least 12 weeks for that to happen. And so if you think about this process of intervening in collecting someone's anger and really holding compassion for it and trying to treat it to the root of it, we have to think in those broad terms. Like we have to wait for our returns 12 weeks at the latest, you know what I mean? Ideally, we want to look at 6 months, we want to look at a year. And to your point about wanting to have this fair or something where we sit down, I would love that. I would love if we had a national or a broad coordinated system with our mental health providers where they meet beforehand, they determine this is what a standard plan that we can offer that each of our specific agencies have signed on to commit to can look like, where the people that sign up and that attend this thing can come to us and know that for the next 6 months, year, they're going to have access to a therapist or some resource, some sense of help, and also a way of tracking it. And so that people can enter the process understanding from the outset that things are not going to change overnight, that if you do backslide, that if you do fail, that if you do regress in behavior, it's not a failure. That's part of the process. You're talking about fundamentally reordering the chemistry of our brains, the way that the patterns that we have been socialized into, it's relating with one another, and that we live out without questioning. Because many times, like this teacher that confronted you, I doubt that they had like a real thought to themselves or like a 5 minutes aside to reflect and review about what's going on. Everything is very much reflexive. And so it's about catching that sequence and trying to find an opportunity for us to invent something new in that space.
Initiating it, right, is going to be the biggest thing. And it's not having to challenge that person. Really, it's bringing it to the people that are in charge of that school and being like, hey, I'm seeing this need. And I'm understanding that if we don't accept these students, that they already get that from all other areas of their life. School's supposed to be safety, right? It's supposed to be acceptance. And you're gonna keep fostering this disbelief in themselves if you don't treat them like humans. If you don't treat them like little tiny adults, because that's what they are, right? Giving them that social, emotional understanding and not having to argue with that teacher, because that's their own path and that's their own problem. But initiating it and being like, you know, this is what I believe in, and standing up for your truth and being like, I'm not gonna argue with you about it, but I am gonna tell you that I see this as extremely important. And, you know, hey, if you'd like to meditate with me for 5 minutes, you know, in between your classes, it seems like you may need it a little bit, you know, like, and see if it changes you. Like, if you can change you, then you're willing to change your students and you're willing to accept them at their level. Because that's why punitive doesn't work, right? Because they already get that everywhere else. They can't, you can't keep treating bad with bad. You know, like, we can't keep using anger and expect that these children are gonna progress. They're not, you know, like they need to be accepted at where they are in their growth, just like any adult, any human being going through something, and foster that growth from their level. Like, don't expect that it's gonna be easy. It's not easy. What human being is easy? What experience is easy? You know, no one's is easy. No one's is gonna be like you're not gonna have a silver bullet. I wish there was something. I was asked that a couple times by a client. He kept asking me almost every 3 months, when are you gonna give me a silver bullet? Like, I'm not, you know, like that's the reality. There is no silver bullet. I'm gonna create this space where we have this trust in one another and we're gonna go through this growth together. And that's extremely important with our youth, right? No, stop using punitive stuff. You know, like they get that too much in society just by what they dress, the way that they approach themselves.
Yeah.
No, everybody has power. You know, everybody has importance.
Kristie, we have your card.
Yes.
Marlon, we don't have your contact information.
I don't actually exist. You're all mass hallucinating me right now. I'm sorry. I don't have a card. I apologize, but I can sign your book if, before the end of the session.
I tried, right? I did tell him to bring cards.
She did. I'm sorry. Really quickly, show of hands, because I know we had you, and then I saw you. I just want to make sure we don't miss anyone out.
I know we said this side first before was there anybody else on this side before we moved back? Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say a couple of things that I've learned while attending this conference, that maybe we can use it to reflect on ways that we have ideas.
Mm-hmm.
One was the Dr. Insel, and he appeared on video, he talked about, and we all talked about, you know, the lack of accountability when it comes to mental health and lack of equity, and that the issue of loneliness being a public health crisis.
Yeah.
And I see it. I have a 27-year-old with an SMI. So when he was in school and even in high school and all that, there were, you know, he was in a social environment and all that. As he's become older, that tends to
being a public health crisis, right? And he talked about mental health being a social justice issue. And it will be, let's take it as if it's like a civil right, kind of similar to that. So how do we engage everyone in our community to feel that way? The idea that we're in this amazing space, and my dream would have been that I would be standing in line because it's people wanting to come and have access to all this information. So how can we get the message out that it is a crisis, that we all can contribute to it?
Well, one of the biggest things, which Marlon did get to watch that yesterday, I thought Thomas and Soul was amazing, and I had already told him last night when I saw him, like, you need to watch this. I'm like, this is really important, because it was powerful, and it's going to be doing things like he just did, right? That whole room felt what he was saying. And so it's putting it out there in a way that we aren't putting it on just one individual, we're putting it on the collective. And we're putting it out in all platforms. So I know that Sacred has started to do like little kind of infomercials. What does Sacred do? Taking it beyond that. I've been trying to push for me and Marlon to get our own podcast. Because I'm like, let's start getting this information out there in a way that we make jokes. But we bring this very serious crisis to the forefront, because that's where I think things are going to have the trickle effect. And if you take a charge of the mental health, you're going to have the understanding that people need their hierarchy of needs met, that they need their social support. And you're going to find a lot of young people don't have that social support. Like that once high school's over, you outgrow or you lose touch with the friends that you had there. And that's why I was like, you're not leaving, right after finding Marlon, because this is a part of our existence, and the fact that we realize that, hey, if we're gonna take this somewhere, we need a partner. It's not just one person, right? It's multiple people. So like, if you did get a copy of my card today, you get in touch with me. I would love to have more people that we could bring to the conversation, and especially young voices. And I'm going to put forth to the people that are in charge of our organizations to be like, we need sessions where we can talk to these individuals, because they already do like at the intersection, right? But it's mostly a lot of the older adults that go, right? We usually are the two youngest ones in the room. And so I've made that comment to him many times. I'm just like, I'm going to sit with you because we're going to talk to other people, but like we get each other's language, or we make jokes with one another. And we want more people like that. And there are more people, but we also are trying to be like, how do we find them? How do we bring them into this conversation and find people that, your son relates to and can be a part of his social network. Then they can grow together into the next phase of their lives.
Sometimes churches can be a really good resource for kids to have fellowship and friendship.
Just any questions here?
Oh, no, I had a comment regarding, first of all, Holly is an amazing individual. But when it comes to like change or modification, the best way is education, but not on a, I guess, belittling level. So my suggestion would be like, explain why, hey, the consequence of this kid is not me taking away the playtime, because I'm taking the consequence of their physical health, their etc. The consequence of now they have to talk to me about it for etc. hours. So you're still providing a consequence, but it's not the consequence that is mainly expected based off what we've done systemically over time, and we've noticed that hey, this actually is adding trauma, adding to our kids. So sometimes having to rephrase or reframe how we speak to other individuals makes more of an impact. Because I know on the inside, I'm like, are you dumb? Like, come on. Like, are you not seeing the pain that you're causing this kid? You're adding to the trauma. But of course, I can't say that out loud, because then now we're fighting. Now we're arguing. But it's all about education and rephrasing it in a manner that it will land. Same with speaking with our youth. Whenever we want to give advice, it's in a manner of not saying the word you, or you should do this. The reason why you're doing this or feeling this is because, etc. That really just creates more of a wall or a barrier with our kids.
When I'm hearing that inner voice, I like to do how. how would you like things to be done for you if you're in an anger space, right? How would you like to be punished if you're not doing the right things at home? You know, like, I know things are going on in your life, you know, how would you approach it as yourself? And then it really makes them have to think, you know, like, oh, I wouldn't want a timeout, right? Like, I wouldn't want recess taken away. So then they really have to go through that, and sometimes you'll see it on their faces, like, oh, like, okay, you know, like, where is that punishment coming from? You know, like, what questions? What would you do differently? You tell me what you would do differently. That is not out of the bucket of things that we already do as a school because it's not working. And, you know, this is something that we can talk about together. What can we do? So how and what are the two questions that I'm always raising them, which is also something that we're trained as clinicians to do. So it comes in handy when you're approaching people that you are screaming in your head, being like, oh my gosh, this individual could use some training, you know?
Do we have any other questions or comments?
So, a tale of righteous anger going on. I would totally understand when you think the word systemic, and nothing is more systemic than our penal system, right? So, when I first came on board, a lot of the attitude I came in with was it's slow to change. There are things that are moderating. We're introducing new ideas. The tree is there, but not where it should be. So, kind of feel that same situation where you're dealing with older colleagues and you're not trying to talk down when you're trying to offer different solutions, and then the weirdest part is being affirmed by people that they're bringing in for conversation of what you said. So, can you imagine how that frustration can build over time? So I get it. So I like what you said of the keyword systemic and all felt like one point or another. Sometimes you just have to move forward with all the drag race here on this, but there was actually
You can't love yourself.
What's that?
So you can't love yourself.
Yeah, well, that too. But the main thing was she was actually about the election. It was Patrice Royale. She was being interviewed by Dan Savage, and said something along the lines of like, on the politics device, said, tell us a time when you got along with someone that you didn't agree with. She looked down the way at her head, she was looking at her and said something, I realized she was living, and I'm at peace with it. And sometimes you're going to have to just accept that, you know, people won't change, but what you can do in your own notice. And like the idea that, you know, he's not rewarding, you're taking time away from that person, from that child, but you're redirecting them. And even though it can't be seen on that level from that person, you know what your intentions are. And you can get peace with, okay, we're going to have to agree.
Healthy boundaries, you know, setting that boundary and being like, well, I'm not going to let you get in my head, you know, like, I know what I'm doing, I know what I'm putting forth, I know what's in my heart with this child, and putting that boundary and being like, okay, we can agree to disagree, and give it out. Yeah.
Because, like, example, and we all know Zen, one of the main things we were just talking about is that you have at your desk in front of you, put you in a position of authority. That doesn't work when you're dealing with someone that's been in the principal's office like all their life. They're only going to have respect if you choose to give it. So that's what you're working for. So if it is impacting the child,
And I know that we want to get into school systems with Bridges to Care. I believe it was SAISD has already reached out to get all their teachers trained. So we would be at teacher in services. And I think that's important. So bringing that to the administrators and being like, hey, I heard about this thing at this conference. And I think it's really important for us to look into because we could use that training. We could use that awareness. And we could use that trauma has a huge impact on everybody. And if that child's been through a lot of trauma, you know, if they're not a problem child, they are expressing the only way that they are allowed to express. And I mean, they're mimicking adults that are in their lives. So it's understanding that we're the ones that put that expectation out there. And if we want to change it, we got to change ourselves too. We got to change where they're getting this information and this feedback from.
I think a lot of what you're talking about also is contingent on like community organizing or even just organizing within your workplace. So if you are, for example, one teacher who is implementing this progressive model that tries to intervene in a way that's not punitive for kids, And that effort can be somewhat undermined by another teacher that maybe does not understand it, or even challenges you in front of the kid, which kind of like calls into question this process for them. That can put the whole sense of growth in jeopardy. But in terms of, even if you can't progress in conversation with that teacher, again, whatever progress you make with that kid can be used as evidence of like, well, this is working in this way. And instead of it just being used solo, I almost wonder what it would mean before you have those conversations with the other person, or even just separate and away from them, to find other like-minded individuals within your workforce that want to do those same things. Maybe they are farther along, or maybe they don't just want to get started, but the more that you all work together to kind of create that same effect within your given spaces, it creates a broader sense of gravity for other people to buy into, and for other people to recognize and be like, oh, well, this looks like that thing that Miss So-and-so mentioned, and I'm seeing this other effort being replicated in this other classroom down the hall. And it also helps to dismantle this idea that you are solo within this change, because as has been said before, and that you are competing with gang members, etc. While we are watching kids learn a little bit more about like the broader aspect of mental health and finding more vocabulary to express their needs, they are still happening, or they are still being socialized alongside kids that are not undergoing those same processes, or are rejecting them in favor of the proven track, something that they know will work, even if it is more dubious or more dangerous in whatever regard. As best as we can hope to standardize that sense of change, we legitimize it. So the more that you can make it happen with more people, the more that other kids see that it's not about an argument that you have to win or a conversation that you have to have. Because again, we recognize that this takes time, and it's going to be more than one conversation, sure. But in the same way that that kid has to choose to give you trust, we kind of have to earn it. And I think we come from earning it by creating a safe environment, and also by, in the same way that your relationship with that kid helps you win over the teacher, that when other kids see them, people doing well or adopting this rhetoric, and they see it working for them, for other kids, they want to model it themselves, or they want to adopt it for themselves, or at least try it on, because school is a place where children discover who they are. So it's all about just keeping it up and remembering that it is in fact a marathon and not a sprint.
And it is if you fall on your face, you're okay. Get up and try again. So initiating these things. We really appreciate all of you coming to our section of the workshop. This was an amazing conversation. I think it went really, really well. We had no idea what to expect coming into this, so we were just like, let's do this. And I think that everybody contributed, and we really enjoyed having all of your faces here and to get to have this feedback, because this is something we can take forth with us.
Can I have one last comment?
Sure.
It's something that I feel like we all spoke about. What I've learned over my experience or my practice is everybody in the world is experiencing dysfunction. And I don't know if anybody ever learned the breakdown of that word, but the DYS in front of function means that it means pain. So it's a medical term for pain. So that's basically what our world is functioning. Our world is functioning in pain. So that's why there's such a huge problem, worldwide, is because we're all dysfunctional, because we all have pain. They're deep-rooted or surface-rooted or whatever. So that's why I always teach my clients is if people have said, what you're doing is dysfunctional or where you live, well, yeah, but so are you. We all have pain. Not everybody talks about it the same. So I just want to say that.
I really appreciate that, because I'd say it's pain and fear. Right? Fear of not being accepted, fear of making the wrong choices.
And loneliness.
And loneliness. So, and I think that's a part of both, that loneliness is a part of the pain and the fear, which keeps you in that loneliness, because you're like, if I come out, somebody's gonna hurt me, somebody's not gonna accept me for who I am. And at some points, yes, it is about just being who you are, but we don't promote how do we get rid of that fear? How do we interpret that pain in a power, and move forth? And so that's part of the learning experience, and how us as a society, all being here, it lets us know that we're not alone, and there are people that believe in this change and this power, and knowing that it's in this, punitive system, in our societal, system that's probably the most, needing reform is amazing that there's individuals like you there. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Also, on the topic of pain, I will say our pain is most potent to ourselves. And so the pain that induces a sense of executive dysfunction where you cannot make decisions, or where you have consistently told yourself how whatever kind of harmful narrative over the course of years that dissuades you from acting in this or that way for your own interests. I think we can sometimes, when we're done in isolation, can fall into this sense of feeling like we can't escape it. And when you do share with other people, when you do have that pain witnessed, but also not just your pain, but your entire selfhood, your worthiness witnessed as well, it creates a ceiling on it, and it creates a threshold, and it can be a good sense of reminder and this kind of supportive buoyancy that says, wait a minute, this person thinks so highly of me, I can rise to the occasion, I can find support and help in this way, so I'm not having to do this by myself. And so easily, just that act of sharing can evaporate so many of the narratives that we tell ourselves, which are in fact myths. But I think it's also important to kind of recognize that when we lapse in periods of inaction, that it's really your mind actually, as much as this might sound long, it's really your mind trying to protect itself. It's really your mind saying that in some way, however long ago, I extended myself in this way, or people gleaned this vulnerability and it cost me. And as best as we can attempt to overcome that, I think it's only going to serve the health of all of us. It needs to be safe for us to connect with one another, because we need each other. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
Welcome to young leadership. You know, that is a lot of what goes on with each other, is those people seeing that value in you and pointing that out, and that actually gives you the safety to grow what they pointed out. Yeah. You know, like it may not be something you immediately saw in yourself in that moment, but then being like, well, if they saw it, right? And then you start to see that it starts to flourish more. You start getting more comfortable doing talks, you know, being in front of other people, having that feedback with somebody else, having criticism without having to take it personally. And so that's young leadership. And we really appreciate all of your feedback, because it kind of wrapped everything up very nicely on all these topics on what we need and how we need young leadership representation.
Thank you all.
Please, before you leave, let us sign your yearbooks, sign each other's yearbooks. If you have an idea, write it down. Please take a moment to connect with one another. Do not let this be the last time, or do not let this conversation be the only action we take to solve this issue.
And we'll be here a little bit later, if after this, as you all start to leave. If you need anything, you want to talk about anything.
Thank you all so much for coming. Please enjoy the rest of your day.